Welcome to the Legacy Crusaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and I'm here with
Jordan.
my brother Jordan. He uses a real name. I don't use a real name. Anyways, today we are talking some Theo-Ri-Oh, specifically on why it's important to play the game correctly, and what do we really mean by playing the game correctly?
Well, we basically mean, going through the proper phases and holding your opponent accountable and yourself to follow through with basic stuff. Like, I've seen a million people just immediately put their Regekis in the graveyard when, they have to go to spell and trap card zone first, and little things like that a lot of the time are irrelevant, but sometimes they are relevant. So it's just a matter of being consistent.
Yeah, and actually playing the game as consistently and as precisely as possible, as annoying as it could be to play the game, or holding your opponent to play the game that way. It's actually to your benefit, and that's what we're going to discuss here, and how to be a better Yu-Gi-Oh player by um, being as specific and careful as possible. So we're going to go through six different topics that will keep your opponent honest and you honest, and keeping everything in the game playing properly. And knowing that you're doing this, you'll actually play much better. So number one, uh, clarifying on what constitutes winning the dice roll, or determining who's actually going first.
Yeah, for some reason, Yu-Gi-Oh has become dice always now. Like it used to be coin flips, rock scissors, whatever the case. Now in live Yu-Gi-Oh, it's always dice, and it's pretty much always high roll with two dice. However, I've definitely had someone try to, I guess, screw me over when I just rolled the dice without asking if it's high roll with two dice, and like I've rolled with one die because that's all I had when my opponent didn't have any dice.
And of course, we rolled a six. So
Yeah, so naturally they're just trying to get one over because it is a competition. Even though we're playing for fun, some people just want to win so badly that they'll be a scumbag about it.
yeah, so what's happened to me in live Yu-Gi-Oh is I did not clarify. I mean, I assumed it was high roll. I said, "We roll a die." Sure, I roll, and then he took that as me handing him the die, even though I rolled a five instead of taking it as a six. And the judge will not rule in your favor for arguing over this because you haven't clarified. So it's in your best interest to clarify, so you only have to roll once, because there's nothing more aggravating and game throwing off than being cheated within seconds of sitting down at the table.
Yeah, I've also seen a lot of times where someone will win the die roll and then they just won't say whether they're going first or not. And I mean, for the longest time now, it's basically been assumed that you're going to go first. However, it shouldn't be. And especially things go on like people will still not say it until they look at their hand, and then they'll like imply they're going second if they have a good going second hand, or vice versa. And it's just more ways people are trying to cheat the rules. And like you need to, whoever wins the die roll, if it's you or your opponent, it's your responsibility, because they're going to try to take every advantage they get to establish who's going to go first before the hands are drawn. This way you're not screwed.
Yeah, I found in regional tournament play, in almost all scenarios, if you do not clarify, your opponent will just do whatever, and it's not necessarily fair to you. So if you win the dice roll, you should verbally state in a very clear way who's going first. If you don't, according to the rule book, you're going first. So you must state who's going first. If your opponent wins the dice roll, since you cannot rely on them to do what they are supposed to do, you need to make an extra effort to make sure that you get verbal confirmation what they intend to do before they look at their hand. Because if they look at their hand, um, they are supposed to go first, but they'll just claim that they said something, and you don't want them saying what they claimed after they've seen their hand, because having the advantage and choosing your position based on what's in your hand is unfair. If you have evenly matched, choosing to go second is not fair if you know it in advance. Whereas they might have great combo cards, so they might change it to going first. So you have to be careful to make sure your opponent isn't making that decision after they see their hand because they mumbled something in advance.
Yeah, it's a matter of not leaving any room for people to give away information. So, for instance, if it's my turn and I'm going second, my opponent has a trap, and I draw, and I just play Pot of Desires. They could technically say, no, go back. I'm flipping this anti-spell in the standby phase. And they would actually be in the right because I'm supposed to declare my phases, and they probably would have flipped it in the standby. And now they know a card that I have. They know it's going to get set, and they are able to potentially target it. They could even watch my hand if they want to and see where it is. Potentially snipe it out with a Twin Twister or something that they set. Or so like it's just a matter of protecting yourself, and you also have to know the rules on phases where both players kind of have to agree to move on. For instance, in the last regional I played, one of my opponents tried to force me to go into the battle phase when I tried to go into the battle phase because he was using a True Draco card that works in my main phase. And he was trying to get me to stay in the battle phase, but that's not how it works. And I had to get a judge, and it was a whole thing. And it's basically just about protecting yourself.
Yeah, he was trying to claim he was in the end of the main phase, so he can't go back into the middle of the main phase, but that's not how it works. If you state you're trying to progress to the next phase, um, and your opponent does not allow you to, you're still in the current phase. And at the resolution of the current action, it's still that phase. So you need to know how that works, and you need to know where you are at all times and make sure everything is going as you want it to go. If
Oh
your
yeah.
opponent does not announce their phases, that's up to you to take advantage of. If they were to play Pot of Desires and you had your anti-spell set, you need to tell them to take it back and then flip your anti-spell. You're welcome to not take cheap shots at your opponent, but why should you disadvantage yourself because they don't want to follow the rules appropriately? There are going to be times when it matters that something was played in a particular order, so you might as well insist that it's always played that way. You don't want to signal when something matters and when it doesn't matter. All right, number 4, making game actions. Normal summoning, inherent summoning, activating a card, setting a card. You always want to offer your opponent the opportunity to respond to every action because the rulebook says that they're entitled to, and not doing so means they can always go back after you expose a card, and they would be right. So getting verbal confirmation that they do not have a response is very important.
After you do a normal summon of like Rescue Rabbit, they're entitled to drop their max C. You can't just do the special, put the guys out there. And like there's some plays, people target things in the graveyard, and then you could respond with DD Crow, so you have to just wait and see. Just
Yeah, getting verbal confirmation commits everybody. You can't, and somebody just saying yes or moving their hand is not good enough. You need verbal confirmation to the best of your ability, unless your opponent, of course, doesn't speak your language, which happens at regionals every once in a while. You'll play someone who's only speaks Spanish or something. You need to ensure that everything is good. Thumbs up might help in those scenarios, but any kind of confirmation that the play that was allowed was allowed. Do not fall into the trap for yourself of playing a card before your opponent approves of it. At a regional recently, I tried to Ash Blossom a Trickstar Reincarnation, and my opponent would not clarify whether or not that was okay. He intended to Droll and Lockbird me, and it was still legal at the time, so he was able to do it, but he kept showing it to me and wasn't really saying anything, and I exposed a Ciphering Gamma for the Droll and Lockbird, so then he Solemn Strike me out of nowhere, so I exposed a card. So you need to get verbal confirmation. Your opponent will bait you into giving them information, whether they intend to or not. The temptation is just there if your opponent's willing to give it away. It is your responsibility to take advantage of it. Other scenarios besides those gameplay actions, there's the battle phase. It's important to take advantage of the start step of the battle phase, which is prior to your opponent choosing attack monsters and attack targets. It just means you're in the battle phase, but no monster is attacked or declared an attack. If your opponent doesn't activate any card effects, they generally will just say, I want to attack with this monster.
yeah, the best example for a card you could abuse in this is Utopia Lightning. People will try to just attack with it, but before it attacks, there's still a part of the battle phase where you can destruct it. so it doesn't have the immunity that it's going to gain when it does attack.
Yeah, and just by stating, well, often it's your opponent attacking you, and you just say during the start step. If you want to activate a card and they didn't specify that they were leaving the start step and get verification from you that that's okay, you can kind of trap them in the battle phase and flip it over in advance with a fairy tale snow or disrupt it in some way because they can't just skip the start step and they need to verify. If you want to get your Utopia the Lightning to attack to go off with no problem, or a Fluffle Sheep, Frightfur Sheep, or Armades, or any of those monsters with that steamroller kind of effect, you can make sure that the start step of the battle phase is okay, and exiting that is fine. Then you can declare an attack, and your opponent can't do anything because you have priority. And once you declare an attack with one of those monsters, your opponent can't do anything. Matter of fact, good play there is to activate a Twin Twister or any other kind of quick play spell because no matter what happens at that point in time, they can't respond. Another thing about the battle phase is, on occasion, the order in which your opponent attacks with certain monsters will matter, and the monsters they attack will matter as well. So, even if they're just attacking into an open board and you're not going to lose this turn, you should clarify the order for future purposes because it'll condition your opponent to play in the correct way. And in some cases, you'll play cards in your deck where you need to respond in a particular order and you need them to play it out in a particular order to win. Such as like having Cypher Beta in your hand, you may need to destroy a particular attacking monster, so the order in which they attack matters, and you don't want to have to tell them when that's going to matter. By telling them that it always matters, you condition them to not think about it when it does matter.
Yeah, like back when Gores was a big thing, people took that more seriously and they attacked in proper order. I remember having a duel where my opponent had well over 8,000 on board, and the way they attacked, I wound up using a Yugioh to protect myself, and they had to cancel an attack with a certain monster, and it saved me like well over the 2,700 life points that it should save me in theory. And it's just a matter like the order does matter, you know.
Yeah, monsters may have to replay their attacks. Some monsters can or can't be destroyed by card effects, and sometimes when they are, a lot of cards say "and if you do this, then something else will happen." So you might need something to happen. The same thing applies to chain links. If your opponent has multiple card effects going off at the same time, you need to ask them what is the chain link order, whether it matters or not. The earlier you do it, even if you don't have something to respond with, let's say you have Cypher and Gamma, I like to use as a good example, and they activate the Wind Witch Ice Bell. And once it summons itself, there are two effects that go off. It's been summoned, so it burns for 500, and the Snow Bell or Glass Bell,
Yeah, I think glass.
Whichever one
searches,
the 4-star activates, and the order in which those cards are applied matters to you. So you may want to Gamma the right one, but by conditioning your opponent to declare their chain links is important. And you don't want to have to tell them when it matters, because then they'll consider how to play around what you're doing. So the earlier you get your opponent playing correctly, the easier it'll be to take advantage of their misplays. All right. Additionally, every time you ask your opponent to do something appropriately, it'll make them feel as though they need to respond soon because you look like you're baiting them into something or you're setting them up and they don't want to fall for your trap. Whereas that's exactly what you're doing. Just by trying to condition them to play correctly, you actually make them fearful that they're playing wrong.
Basically, you're establishing the proper rituals so that you don't have to give away when you do have a counter because they're going by the proper rituals already, and now you could respond appropriately when you need to.
Yeah, because a judge is actually going to laugh off when you tell them that they didn't state the chain link of their Ice Bell and Glass Bell. They're going to say, tell your opponent to tell you the right order. And I mean, it's clear to you that you might have a Ghost Ogre or a Cypher Gamma, and you don't want to have to tell that to your opponent, and you shouldn't have to. So, since a judge isn't going to like penalize your opponent for that, you're going to need to hold them accountable by insisting that they always play correctly. If you play a card like a Mirror Force in your deck, even though your opponent might be setting up a big board and attacking you for game, you don't want them to know you play a Mirror Force. So if you have a set card, you don't want to surrender in advance. You want to condition them that they're going to have to attack to find out. All right. Number 5. You want to ensure that your opponent sees what cards you search and are given the opportunity to read the cards that they search. All right. As soon as you know for sure that they have seen the card, they should not have to ask you what the card is again. Yeah, once you've shown it to them, it is no longer public knowledge. Once it's been verified that you have searched the card, that was a legal requirement of the card search that was applied. So if you played E-Emergency Call, you have to search a hero monster. If once they verified that it is a hero monster and they've seen what hero it is, they should not need to ask you again what card is in your hand. You do not need to tell them. That is no longer any of their business. So make sure that they see it. Preferably, you would make them read it as well. The sooner that they've read the card, the more likely they are to put the burden of memorizing what the details are of the card are on them. Additionally, once they take that responsibility on, they're less likely to ask for clarification and might potentially make misplays in reference to what they think the card actually does versus what the card actually does. It's possible that they read the card and just suddenly forget what it says, and they may ask to see it again. The closer it is to when you actually did the search is more realistic for you to let them read it again or to just show it to them, because you don't need them to know if you discard it as a cost or used it for an Xyz summon and it's no longer like where it is. You don't want your opponent to be able to ask you where the card is or that you still have the card. So at some point you need to just state, I can't tell you if that card is here. Or if you want to know, you can ask the judge, and the judge will clarify the text of any card in the game. So it's not their right to know if a card is in your hand. As long as you provide them the opportunity to see that it was there when it was supposed to be there, then you're playing correctly.
Yeah, your opponent also should read anything that they don't know what it does, because it's their responsibility to play properly. For instance, if you summon an Infernoid Decatron, and that's Rogue typically. It was only meta for a short time, Infernoids. So if they don't know what it does, they should have to read it, and then they also don't know that the cards that it might send, if they don't know their effects, they won't know whether or not they should use, let's say, an Ash on it, and that's their responsibility. So if they let it go through, and then they see you're moving a card from the deck to the grave, and they're like, "Oh, I could have ashed that," like they can't just go back. It was when you summoned it and declared the effect. That's when they're supposed to make their decision. You're not supposed to be able to carry on your play, and then they just take things back when they realize after. And it's already annoying enough that if you're playing Rogue, your opponent asks you what every little card does.
Yeah.
Let them read it. That's basically the main point I'm trying to make. Is
hold your opponent accountable to read the cards and to respond appropriately based on what they've read. I think we've tried the joke before of just saying, when they say what the card does, you just say it does 8,000 damage, you lose.
Yeah.
Because it kind of implied that we're not going to tell you and you really need to know, or we can just make up whatever we want.
I mean, it is your right to know, but there's so much text, and I'm trying to make other moves. Like, I've misplayed so many times just by being a nice guy and explaining my card, and then if you forget something, because these cards have pages of text on them, so a lot of the time if you ask your opponent what their card does, they'll only tell you part of its effect too, if that's the only part they're using currently. Which I get it, but that's why it's your responsibility to read it and make sure there's no other things. And also, people misplay their own cards all the time, constantly. That's why I'm always reading my opponent's cards, because they're basically cheating me, whether it's intentional or unintentional, all the time. So as long as you could read, which I'm sure you can, you may as well.
Yeah, you also don't want to be accused of misinforming your opponent of the game state. So you don't want to have to be the one to tell them what a card does. Number 6, keep accurate track of life points, turns in time in the round, and of course when time in the round is coming, and if possible, where the judges are, and if there's a judge around. Life points kept on paper supersede those kept on a calculator. So if you and a opponent are arguing over life points, and you have a judge to verify what's going on, your account will be more important than your opponent's. because yours is written. Um, Everybody should together be keeping life on paper and verifying with one another. But
Yeah, personally, after any damage calculation, I always tell my opponent, "Oh, I have you at so and so, and me and so and so. You have the same, right?" And then they'll typically say yeah, and we'll move on. And if they say no, we try to backtrack it before we get any further into the duel, figure it out, and we typically can, and then we continue.
yeah, I'm not particularly good at asking them for verification, where I should. Sometimes they'll just say a number that's different from what I've written, and I'll think about it, and they'll help me catch when I made a mistake. But uh, generally, that just means our life is higher. So, I try not to worry so much. But yeah, it's good to keep it written. Uh, in reference to time, um, if I don't know if I assume if you're listening this far, you play in tournaments. So if you're playing in a tier, I can't remember if it's tier 1 or tier 2. Local events, there are uh, what's considered zero, one, two, three turns in time, where both players get 2 turns, including the turn that time is called, to complete the game, and whoever's life is higher is winning. So if you're at your local event and time is called, and you're at the end, ready to end your turn, you've kind of just wasted a turn. So you don't want to be turn 0 uh, when time is called. So it's in your best interest to end your turn um, when you see the time is running out, or when you hear time is running out, or maybe you should verify when time's going to end and try and end it on your opponent's turn. It's in your favor to have the last turn because it gives you the final option on determining whether or not you're going to take the lead in life points or if you're going to lose. Additionally, you might not have to do anything. Your opponent has to try and break through on the previous turn, and they might not be able to. So you want to give them less turns. And if they do manage to get through, you have a turn to play against it. Um, one last thing in reference to time, which is monitoring slow play. You really can't just claim your opponent is slow playing. You really need a judge to witness slow play. So if you feel your opponent is slow playing, you should ask a judge anything to get them over to you to keep an eye on your game. If you're in time, judges tend to be watching your games anyway to verify that the games are progressing properly. I had a game at the most recent regional where my opponent didn't flip summon a monster for 5 minutes. He had 2 cards in his hand, one was an honest, and he had a set monster. He didn't really have much decision making to make. He was ahead in life. We were in time, so it was not in my best interest to sit there. So I tried to get access to a judge. Um, Anyways, that's going to wrap up our discussion of why it's important to play accurately. The more accurately you play, the less likely um, things are to go against your plans. Um, Generally, we assume everyone's playing the game correctly, but not everybody does. And my brother earlier mentioned ensuring players that some players will just put their Raigekis in the graveyard instead of playing them to the field. Keep in mind that zones do matter, and every once in a while that will matter. So make sure,
Especially now more than ever.
yeah, with links and so on, and cards like Broken Line or Shut Line. I forget what the Magical Musketeers
Yeah.
will matter where things are placed. So placement on the field is very important. So even if you're not playing a card where it matters, you should hold your opponent uh, to play cards in the correct positions as well. Anyways, that's going to wrap up this video, and we will see you guys next time. In Theo-Ri-Oh!